Hi, everyone, and welcome to Weather Classroom. I'm Thomas Patrick, meteorologist with Crem 2 News in Spokane, Washington. Hopefully, you're enjoying all the great fall air and the fall colors outside. Here in eastern Washington, got quite a bit of rain on the way, so I think we're just a little past peak in terms of the fall foliage. Nonetheless, it is beautiful outside. Glad to be back for another weather classroom this week. Just want to note a couple things before we begin. One, you may notice that the lighting situation isn't as crystal clear as it was before. I'm going through a small rearrangement slash rebranding phase with the graphics and the overlays here. So this is all going to look just a little bit different in the coming weeks, but look for those updates later on down the pipeline. But today's weather classroom topic is going to be on firestorms, and that's because here in Spokane, Washington, last week on October 16th, we just had the 30-year anniversary of what is known as Firestorm in Spokane, and that was back in 1991. I wanted to cover just what is the actual meteorological definition of a firestorm and how does that event from 30 years ago fit into that definition. So to today's topic, and the content today. First, I show you a video. This from our photographers. We actually still have a photographer working at Crem 2 News that covered Firestorm back in 1991, and the images were almost unreal to the city. When you think of wildfires, you probably think of a lot of backcountry areas, a lot of dense forests and wooded regions, but obviously fires are a real natural disaster possibility for any city across the western US. And obviously, with such a high populated area, Spokane being the second most populous city in the state of Washington, when you get this rolling through parts of town, it obviously starts to affect many people, many homes, all in a very short period of time. On this particular day in 91, which was October 16th, was warm and it was windy and it was bone dry leading up to this event, which created the devastation that we saw on that day 30 years ago. So the weather conditions that we saw in Firestorm were obviously up there in terms of red flag warning like conditions, the dry and the windy and the warm conditions. In total in Firestorm, just for some background information, 92 wildfires around the Spokane County area. So that does kind of deviate a little bit into some of our neighboring counties, but basically 92 fires, 18 of them large within this Spokane County radius. 3,500 acres burned, 114 houses also burned in that event from 30 years ago. As for those weather conditions during Firestorm, it was 76 degrees the day before, and that was a record high temperature. Then 67 on that day. But more importantly were the wind speeds. 62 mile per hour winds recorded during the event. Even severe winds, which are 58 miles per hour or 50 knots, which is what is used to define severe thunderstorm warnings and severe wind criteria, that lasted for almost 4 hours during the midday on that day. So once the wind was able to cause damage, particularly power lines falling on dry grass, and that's basically sparking, ignited the wildfires that we saw on that day. And the precipitation, there was basically none in the 2 months and then some leading up to the event. In fact, from August 7th to October 16th, 6/100ths of an inch of rain was the record driest stretch that we've seen for that. I believe it's like a 9-10 week period leading up to the event. So tinderbox dry conditions, as it is sometimes known as. But this is called Firestorm, but it's actually a little bit of a parallel in terms of what meteorologists would consider a firestorm. So what is a firestorm? Well, the definition from the National Weather Service defines it as when a wildfire creates its own wind system. So it actually has nothing to do with how much, how many acres burned or how many homes burned or how many lives lost. It has nothing to do with that, or actually the impact. It's all from a meteorological perspective. Fire can create its own wind. And when you get a wildfire that's large enough and strong enough and aggressive enough that starts to create its own wind system, that is what's called a firestorm. So a lot of large wildfires that we see every year in the western US exhibit these conditions to be classified as a firestorm. Basically, what happens is that the fire itself causes hot air to rise, creating a low pressure area at its base. So wind has to rush in to fill in that void created by the low pressure area, and you can get these circulations, the warm air rising and the outer air filling it in. This motion can create fire clouds, or pyrocumulus, which is my second favorite type of cloud, second only to lenticular clouds. So this is all what a firestorm is. Again, it has nothing to do with homes burned or acreage burned. It's about the fires themselves and the weather conditions that they produce. And the images help to define and help us give context to what a firestorm is. These are pyrocumulonimbus clouds, basically fire thunderstorm clouds from an Oregon fire back in 2014. And this is a fantastic image to analyze because it shows us how the fire is creating its own wind. There's basically, clear skies for probably dozens of miles. You see some clouds in the background there as well. But what's happening is that you get the warm air created by the fire itself. That warm air rises, creates a low pressure at its base, and then the winds basically fill in and kind of ingest that next bit of air into the fire itself. So it is very incredible to see this wind system turn over. It creates a lot of instability in the atmosphere, and since it did create so much instability, it wasn't just cumulus clouds, it was cumulonimbus clouds, thunderstorm clouds. The kind of silver lining is sometimes these clouds can cause rain, and it can actually rain on the fire that created it in the first place. It tends to be rare, but it is a possibility. These clouds are easily visible from space as well. I use these satellite imagery, the images from our GOES 17 West Coast satellite, all the time on our weathercasts, and this was just one that I had saved from the Bootleg fire just this year, also in Oregon. And all these clouds that are extending from the origin of the fire, these are pyrocumulus clouds that are easily visible and traveling. All the surrounding grayness, that's the hazy conditions created by the fire, but this would be a firestorm because the fire itself is creating its own winds, creating its own cloud system from that one fire. In the most intense scenarios, we can get fire tornadoes. Well, these are more typically called fire whirls. They're a bit more closely related to dust devils, but you're just adding fire to them. But same principle applies. Hot air near the ground has to rise, but in this case there's a little bit of rotation involved, so it kind of whirls and spins itself up and starts extending upward in what is called a fire whirl. And yes, wildfires can create these quite often. Now, if you combine this with the pyrocumulus clouds from earlier, that can actually be supported by the thunderstorm cloud itself. That would be a fire tornado. Otherwise, this would be considered a fire whirl. Again, more closely related to dust devils in nature. So again, this had nothing to do with that wildfire storm event in Spokane, Washington, in 1991. We call that Firestorm because it obviously impacted so many people, and that is how people recognize the event, as firestorm. But from a meteorological perspective, a firestorm is defined by a wildfire that creates its own wind because it is burning so hot and so intense that the atmosphere itself has to be adjusted. The air from that fire is kind of warmed almost unnaturally, though it is a naturally occurring phenomenon, wildfires, of course. But it does it in such a way that the atmosphere adjusts for it, and that is what is called a firestorm because of all that wind and the pyrocumulus that we see caused by it. So that is the firestorm definition, coming off the backs of the 30-year anniversary of Spokane's firestorm in 1991. Obviously, we take this seriously. Windy conditions prompt red flag warnings all the time across the western U.S., and those are the conditions that can lead to ignition events and firestorms themselves. And these wildfires, like the Bootleg fire in Oregon, can burn for months and months before they are fully contained. So obviously, these are quite a challenge to contain, especially for the firefighters that work so diligently in the western U.S. But that'll do it for today's Weather Classroom. Hopefully you enjoyed that topic. Going through a small rebranding stage, so again, I might not be as perfectly lit here on the camera as I'd like to be, but that will be fixed in some future episodes. If you'd like to see any other Weather Classrooms, you can check out the playlist right here at the Krem2 News YouTube page, and please do not forget to like, comment, and subscribe so that way you don't miss a future episode of Weather Classroom. But that will do it for me. Have a great rest of your Friday and weekend. Hopefully you get a chance to enjoy the fall colors as well. You can find me anywhere on social media at Thomas Patrick WX. And if you have a weather topic that you'd like me to cover, I would be more than happy to lend an ear or explain anything that the weather world may throw at us. So until next time, take care, everybody, and we'll see you later.